Why hello you lovely little peppercorns, my name's Noa Lee, god of game criticism and lord of excellent taste, and Another Crab's Treasure is a Souls-like 3D platformer from Seattle-based indie developer Aggro Crab, and is one that has managed to transcend its labels to become something far more valuable than pretty much every Souls-like that came before it, despite a handful of missteps and dropped balls along the way. Like a lot of gamers these days, I tend to groan when I hear the term Souls-like, as it has been among the trendiest of gaming trends for quite some time now and shows no signs of slowing down. Yet when I first watched the trailer for Another Crab's Treasure, I could instantly tell that this wasn't going to be just another Dark Souls clone with a different coat of paint, but one that merely took inspiration from what is easily my favorite series of video games ever and did something new with it, or at least that's what I hoped. The Souls-like genre, as I'm sure you're all more than aware, is a genre that for the past 10 years or so has been an attempt by other developers to capitalize on the success of From Software's Souls series, or the Soulsborne series, or the Soulsborne Necro Ring series. You know what, I'm just gonna stick with Souls series, y'all know what I mean. The Souls games, as I never tire of saying, are among the best games ever made, if not the best games ever made, and there are very few titles that even come close to rivaling the level of quality and artistic achievement that From Software has consistently delivered. I'd have a hard time telling you what my top 10 favorite games are, but if you ask me what my top 7 are, it would be these, in no particular order. So, seeing as I adore the Souls series so much, you'd think I'd be a huge fan of the Souls-like genre, right? Well, no, because while there sure are a lot of these games around these days, and some of them, like last year's Lies of P, are actually quite good, none of them are great, at least none of the ones that I've played, as practically all of them misunderstand why FromSoft's work is so special in the first place, and those that do understand copy their work so meticulously that the project ended up as little more than a bargain bin ripoff of something far, far greater. Like, Lies of P, you're good and all, but I'd honestly rather just play Bloodborne again for the 80th time, thank you very much. It's this forceful design of your average Souls-like that I take issue with here, as the goal of these games always seems to be to make a Souls-like rather than to make a good game, and if you've been keeping up with the videos on this channel, which you should by the way, as I try to build upon my theories and ideas about game criticism in each and every video, then you know that I'm all about a concept that I like to call heart, which I define as a state of playful creation that allows the project itself to dictate the direction it goes in, rather than the creator trying to force each and every aspect of said project to fit their initial vision. This, to me, is why every Souls-like sets itself up for failure from the get-go. If the goal is to make a Souls-like, and during development the project starts deviating from that initial vision, as artistic pursuits so often do, then the only options are to follow the project where it wants to go, or tug on the reins to get it back on track. And it's this tugging on the reins that causes these Souls-likes to lose heart and become merely a product and a piece of entertainment when they potentially could have ended up as great works of art had the developer been willing to trust the artistic process just a little bit more. People say I'm crazy, but you can feel when this happens. Games that have been forced to fit a certain mold rather than ones that are allowed to grow and change exude an air of dispassion and hackiness that colors the whole experience, at least when judging them as a work of art as opposed to just pieces of entertainment. This is why, to me, the only games that are reminiscent of the Souls series that end up being worth a damn are the ones that transcend this label and grow into something more. Hollow Knight's the obvious example of this, as that game clearly began life as an attempt to make a 2D Dark Souls, yet Team Cherry had the artistic bravery to trust their muse and allow the project to evolve as it saw fit. The Souls-like DNA is certainly still there, but the game ended up as something that was merely influenced by the Souls series, rather than trying to recapture that magic with a different coat of paint. And that's exactly what Another Crab's Treasure does. Aggro Crab had an initial vision and set out to make a cartoony Souls-like, yet the game was nurtured and allowed to grow into something that ostensibly is still a Souls-like, but overall is something that stands far apart from the typical Souls-like crowd and isn't afraid to do its own thing. It's a game with a lot of heart that doesn't suffer from a forced design. Well, with one caveat that we'll get to towards the end of the video. Aggro Crab, as a developer, seems to have a knack for putting a much-needed spin on the biggest gaming trends, as their first game, Going Under, managed to be a fresh and offbeat take on the dungeon-crawling roguelike genre that's arguably even more trendy than Souls-likes, especially among indie titles. And Another Crab's Treasure is a game that, like its predecessor, isn't afraid to experiment in an oversaturated genre, and unlike its predecessor, manages to rise far above its initial image of crab Dark Souls and evolve into something unique and artistically brilliant, for the most part. You play as Krill, a little hermit crab living the dream in a tide pool on the edge of the known ocean. Krill's life is one of leisure, meekness, and a desire for a simple and easygoing life, one where everything is perfect and uncomplicated as long as it's just him and his beloved shell, which he has called home for most of his life. However, one day a greedy loan shark claiming to be working for a local duchess who now supposedly owns the tide pool pays him a visit to collect some taxes. Krill, not understanding what a duchess, taxes, or even the concept of currency are, is more than a little taken aback by this sudden intrusion into his life and is, of course, unable to pay the swindler. Naturally, the loan shark repossesses Krill's beloved shell and takes off into the greater ocean, leaving Krill to either accept his misfortune or chase after the scoundrel and try to get his shell and, by extension, his easygoing life back. And the latter, without hesitation, is exactly what he does. This is a simple little setup that I quite like as it's straightforward and quick in its execution, getting the player right into the game without dumping mountains of exposition upon you in an attempt to get you invested in the narrative. Make no mistake, there's a lot more to the story than that, and we'll talk about more as we go along, but for now, the journey is all about getting Krill's shell back, and that's all we need. I also like that the game is already laying the groundwork for one of its central themes by having Krill throw all caution to the wind and racing after the man who stole his shell without a second thought, as throughout our journey, Krill continues to make the claim that he just wants everything to go back to normal and that everything he's doing is in pursuit of that goal, yet the actions he takes and the lengths he goes to in order to achieve this goal hint at a deeper desire and ambition within him, something that's always been there but has been ignored and stamped down out of his personal fears and complacency. This metaphor of coming out of one's shell is a little on the nose, I'll admit, but it's so otherwise subtly woven into the narrative and perfectly reinforced by the game's mechanics that I can't help but admire and personally relate to this theme and how it colors Krill's character and the choices he makes throughout his journey. I like it. Shortly after leaving the tide pool, Krill discovers that the ocean isn't as he once thought it was, as many of its residents are infected with a strange malady which causes them to attack passersby on sight, forcing him to either run away or fight using a conveniently placed crab fork that he happens to find. And this, right here, is your weapon for the remainder of the game, which already makes us less crab Dark Souls and more crab Sekiro, as combat and the progression of the game isn't about finding a build that fits your playstyle or experimenting to find the right gear for a given situation, but rather about learning the timing and nuances of your core abilities and how to leverage those abilities to exploit the weaknesses of your foes. It's a combat system that can initially feel a bit sparse in comparison to the Souls series, even Sekiro, which is its closest cousin in terms of raw combat, as you don't initially have standard moves like running or jumping attacks, rolling attacks, or weapon arts / shinobi skills. That, to me, is one of the first inklings I had that the developers were following the path of heartful design that I personally advocate for. Rather than simply copying Dark Souls, or more accurately Sekiro, the game isn't afraid to carve out its own combat and progression system, and in a way that reinforces the themes central to the game itself. One of the ways that the game does this is by leveraging the tried and true skill tree progression system found in practically every action game of the past 20 years. Normally, I don't like skill trees unless they're used only for stat buffing or passive augmentations to your character, as I find the act of arbitrarily locking certain maneuvers and actions behind an upgrade system to be a bit silly and occasionally detrimental to the game itself. For example, as much as I adore Sekiro, I can't deny that it can be a bit guilty of this very thing, with techniques like the Makiri counter that allows you to stomp on an enemy's weapon when they try to do a thrust attack and deal massive posture damage in the process, really feeling like a core part of Wolf's moveset that the game expects you to have at your disposal throughout your journey, yet it's unlocked through one of your skill trees and could very easily be ignored or overlooked by the player who might not understand how important mastering this skill is to many of the game's combat encounters. However, unlike most games that lock certain techniques behind a node in a skill tree, I actually think this works to the game's favor here, as it forces the player to first concentrate on and learn the basics of the game's most interesting set of mechanics, which is the shell system. This also works thematically as well, as unlike Sekiro and most action games for that matter, you're not playing as a seasoned warrior, but just a little guy who's probably never even been in an argument prior to the start of the game, let alone a full-on fight, so the idea of the game slowly introducing new abilities and techniques via a skill tree makes a lot of sense, as this coincides with the rise in confidence and skill level of both Krill and the player themselves. However, the one thing that Krill does understand from the get-go is the need for a shell to protect himself, and in this regard, being a hermit crab, he's able to use just about anything as a shell, with your block button causing you to hide entirely within whatever makeshift shell you happen to have equipped, with attacks dealt to you only dealing damage to the shell itself rather than to you directly. These shells act as both your armor set and shield throughout the game, with each each shell having its own attributes that add a lot of variety into the combat as well as your defensive capabilities. The first of these attributes is the shell's weight, with each shell falling into either a small, medium, or large weight class that directly affects how well and how far you can dodge, roughly equivalent to the light, medium, and fatty rolls that Souls fans will be accustomed to, with lightweight shells allowing you to be more agile and harder to hit, and heavier shells providing more defense at the cost of reduced dodging mobility. The difference here is that, unlike the Souls series, your armor isn't a permanent fixture, but rather a disposable asset, with the game forcing you to mix and match and use what's around you rather than finding something that you like and relying on that for the whole game, although the ability to ensure your favorite shells that you unlock after the first major boss could allow you to do just that if you really don't feel like experimenting, but personally I feel like you'd be missing out on a lot of what this game has to offer if you were to try and play that way. This I very much like, as it adds a lot of variety into the combat and core gameplay, as you're always on the lookout for better shells that fit different situations or need to make do with something that's less than ideal if your shell happens to break at an inopportune moment, though I can't imagine this being a bit of a turnoff for a lot of Souls players, especially those who rely on min-maxing their builds in order to succeed rather than getting good as these games expect you to. However, it's the other key aspect of shells that really makes this system come alive, as in addition to each shell providing you with different weights and defenses, each shell also has its own special ability that essentially stands in for the game's magic system, with each ability that the shells offer being directly tied to what the object you're wearing happens to be. For example, wearing a soda can will allow you to fire bubbles at your foes, which do a small amount of damage to both their health and posture. Party favors like hats and confetti poppers can be used to do some serious close-range shotgun damage. Sushi rolls and banana peels can be munched on to gain a little health back. Coffee pods and teacups will give you a caffeine buzz that will temporarily increase your attack speed, and so much more. It's this sheer variety of abilities combined with their defensive stats that makes Another Crab's Treasure's shell system a lot of fun, as well as providing a lot of depth to the combat, while the fact that there are shells littered all over the place means that even though these shells break frequently as you take damage, you'll rarely find yourself without something to quickly swap to that might actually be more advantageous than what you initially had on anyway, as the developers were very careful with where and how often they place different shells in order to always give you something that is at least usable for whatever area of the game you happen to be in at that moment. Normally I don't like a system like this where you're forced to constantly switch up your gear because of a degradation system. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. Excuse me. But in this game, I think it works very well, since the thing that's degrading is your armor/shield rather than your weapon, and only if you mess up and take a hit or choose to block and sacrifice some of your shell vitality to protect yourself. Unlike some certain Zelda games I not so subtly hacked up just now, you'll always be able to attack regardless of what state your shell or lack thereof happens to be in, which makes a world of difference in not only making a system like this tolerable, but also enjoyable when combined with the offbeat abilities tied to each shell. These shells also reinforce another theme at the heart of the game, which is Another Crab's Treasure's environmental message. Now, normally when a game tries to act as allegory for or present a theme that stands in for real-world problems, the developers run the risk of getting more than a little preachy, ham-fistedly banging you over the head with their message in a way that distracts from the rest of the game. But for the most part, Another Crab's Treasure walks the fine line between standing on a soapbox and not reinforcing its themes enough with grace and precision, allowing its environmental message to be present at all times, but only taken into consideration if the player is willing to engage with it. This is all reinforced through the excellent world building and visual design of the game, which imagines an undersea world that's one part natural beauty and one part trash heap, as this part of the ocean that the game takes place in is a veritable dumping ground of humanity's waste and excess, all of which regularly falls from an island of floating garbage that occasionally comes around. However, the developers smartly use the reality of this world not merely as some calamity that's destroying the lives of the residents that inhabit the ocean floor, but rather as a boon that's allowed them to progress both technologically and sociologically, using this trash to build cities, protect themselves from the dangers of the ocean, as well as feeding and clothing themselves, in addition to developing an economic system revolving around the use of microplastics as currency, with Krill in particular having the ability to use these microplastics to level up and increase his stats in a manner right out of the Souls series. And while some of the more observant characters that you meet throughout your journey seem to have an uneasy relationship with the trash that built the world, most of the ocean's residents see this trash as a gift from the heavens and a resource that should be celebrated. Of course, being that trash is a resource that nearly everyone wants has caused some of the more greedy and power-hungry denizens of the ocean to leverage this fact to become obscenely rich or orient their entire outlook and identity around the pursuit of becoming rich, with mega capitalist Roland practically owning the entire ocean by running factories and mining operations, while small-time swindlers like Pronathan, the man who actually stole Krill's shell, making a living by selling stolen goods and by conning the lower class. But perhaps the most interesting of these is the character of Firth, who sort of stands in as a mirrored version of Krill. Firth is an ambitious hermit crab who idolizes Roland and wishes to one day be as filthy rich and powerful as he is, yet throughout his journey and his interactions with Krill and the other characters, his outlook shifts from merely looking out for himself to a delusional righteous will to use the power of wealth and industry to benefit society and make the world a better place, still clinging to the belief that the trash that comes from the heavens is a godsend that can be used to save the world if only it's used carefully and by the right people. But as you might expect, it's this very trash that is the source of the strange malady that causes the ocean's denizens to get gunked up and go mad. Clearly, this is all meant as an allegory for humanity's reliance on fossil fuels as the thing that allows us to grow and progress as a species, but also as something that's slowly poisoning the world around us. And with the exception of that one caveat that I keep mentioning, the game manages to maintain a subtle and nuanced take on the nature of this oft-maligned double-edged sword, bringing the player along for the ride and delivering a bittersweet sensation the likes of which is so rarely well done in video games. Because while in the game, as well as in real life, the idea of hermit crabs using humanity's refuse as shelter or even food is a tragedy that points to our failure as caretakers of the earth, it's also kind of cute and whimsical at the same time, and this is the very mixture of opposing emotional responses that Another Crab's Treasure provides as backdrop for its excellent gameplay and tight controls. This feeling is further reinforced by the lengths that the developers went to perfectly create the look and design of products from our own world that, upon a first glance, look as though they're actually a box of goldfish crackers, a tank of blue rhino propane, or a tub of I can't believe it's not butter, but upon closer inspection, you find them to instead be satirical takes on these consumer goods with cheesy guns, blue dino, or I swear to God if this isn't butter, I'm seriously going to lose it, the original. Meanwhile, the shells that Krill makes use of throughout his journey are a necessary evil that keeps him safe and allows him to fight, while the colorful bits of plastic, cardboard boxes, and discarded bric-a-brac add a lot of beauty and visual intrigue to the game as well, providing much of the structure that makes up the bulk of the game's excellent level design. It's this nuanced take on the unfortunate necessity of this garbage that causes Another Crab's Treasure to rise far above merely acting as an allegory for humanity's reliance on fossil fuels and our wastefulness as a species, delivering an experience that's as horrifying as it is whimsical, as sad as it is funny, and one that both highlights and embraces the violence central to all conflict, making the claim that the problem isn't violence itself, but violence not being directed at the right people and problems. This theme of anger and violence being used for good is most embodied in the character Chitin, who's a warrior lobster who Krill meets early on in his journey. Initially, she's merely a guard for the Duchess of Slacktide, but she soon sets out on her own journey to grow in strength and use that strength to find and kill all those who do harm to the ocean itself and the innocents who live there. As the game goes on and Krill's journey shifts from merely trying to get his shell back to going on a treasure hunt and finally seeking after an ancient magical relic called the Perfect Whirl, he and Chitin continue to cross paths, and each time she tries to goad out of him the need to take action and embrace the violent tendencies within himself and use that power to hunt down and destroy evil. Krill continues to resist her outlook and solution, yet each time they meet, he has grown immensely in power and killed countless more foes, with both Chitin and the game's very mechanics commenting on this violent nature and knack for killing that Krill, as well as the player, clearly has, but is unwilling to acknowledge in himself. As you progress further into the game, Krill will grow more in strength as he reluctantly embraces the harsh realities of this world and realizes that the name of the game is kill or be killed, that even ocean denizens that haven't gone mad from the gunk can be just as dangerous or even more so than those that have, the realization of which is perfectly mirrored by both the player's rising skill level as well as the increasing number of maneuvers and techniques Krill learns through the skill trees. These new abilities allow him to access and leverage new and creative ways to dispatch his foes, such as the ability to stick almost any shell onto the end of your fork, allowing you to use it as a large hammer that deals far more damage than it normally can, while you unlock mainstay Souls-like combat augments like running and jumping attacks, as well as a Sekiro-style grappling mechanic that, in addition to allowing you to latch onto barbed hooks out in the wild to grapple around with, can also be used to pull an enemy towards yourself or pull yourself towards an enemy at the cost of using a fishing hook that you can find and purchase as a consumable item. You can also learn to parry with your shell by hiding inside of it and then popping out at the very moment when an enemy's attack is about to land, which deals a ton of posture damage and briefly staggers them, as well as allowing you to instantly riposte for some extra damage. Added to this, special abilities called adaptations, which allow you to perform a sort of magical attack, such as summoning a giant claw that can briefly stagger an enemy and cause them to take extra damage for a few seconds, an electric eel that can be used to activate electrical devices as well as briefly stun lock your enemies, and a powerful phantom mantis shrimp punch that can break open certain obstacles as well as dealing a ton of damage to your foes. And this combat system that was a little sparse at the beginning of the game ends up evolving into one that's quite complex and full of nuances that the player can utilize both in the environment as well as in combat. Slowly expanding upon the core moveset of a character in an action game as it progresses is not an easy thing to do well, as more often than not a game will start out with too complex of a moveset, so the player has a hard time getting the basics down before advanced techniques are introduced, or a game will start out sparse like this one but never actually introduce enough to make it shine by the end. Yet Another Crab's Treasure deftly avoids this so often stumbled into pitfall by perfectly introducing new mechanics and skills at just the right moments throughout the game, and fully exploring and developing Krill's core moveset by the time it's all said and done. This same careful consideration and slowly building upon ideas is also seen in another key aspect that sets this game apart from the larger Soulslike crowd, which is its focus on 3D platforming in addition to its tight combat. At first, it doesn't really seem like this is the case, but as the game goes on, the amount of platforming the player is asked to do in order to traverse the world increases to the point that by the end, you'll be asked to take on some tricky Blue Fire-esque platforming sections that require precise timing and quick reflexes. These moments are a lot of fun and can be one hell of a challenge, as the game is essentially taking a standard Souls-like movement system and finding ways to make it work in a 3D platforming setting, rather than just giving Krill an additional set of 3D platforming controls that are separate from his combat abilities. It's a nice addition to the Souls-like formula that I, as a 3D platforming fan, really appreciate. However, the game is also restrained enough that the platforming never takes over entirely, and more importantly, never distracts from the core of the game, which is its excellent combat and focus on exploration. In practice, these platforming sections only enhance the already stellar level design, which overall opts for a more sandbox style of level layout rather than the tight corridor Metroidvania-esque design of most Souls-likes. Each area you go to can be tackled and traversed in a wide variety of ways, and most likely you'll have to go through these areas multiple times if you wish to find all of the hidden goodies and secret paths that they have to offer. And in that regard, I really have to commend the game for having faith enough in itself and its players to have entire areas, items, and abilities that could be overlooked and missed in a playthrough, and filling these areas with shortcuts that could allow for sequence breaking and speedrunning, as well as providing the player with a handful of hidden bosses and enemies that are entirely optional. That's almost always a sign of a quality experience and a heartful design, as very few developers are willing to put in the work necessary to make optional areas and bosses in general, let alone ones that are so well hidden that the vast majority of players will likely never find them. But for the few that do, these additions always add a ton of magic and charm to a game, as well as vastly increasing the desire for replaying it, which is something that I will absolutely be doing, and probably before the end of this summer, because the game is just that good. I can't say that for any other Souls-like that I've ever played, and for that reason alone, Another Crab's Treasure is, in my mind, the best Souls-like bar none, and it's about frickin' time that we got one that wasn't just good, but genuinely great, nearly reaching the level of enjoyment and artistic achievement of FromSoft's own work. However, that doesn't mean that the game is without its problems, and I wouldn't be doing my duty as Game Critic Supreme if I failed to mention them. The first of these is in terms of balancing. Overall, the game is very well balanced, and while often challenging, is rarely punishing, yet each and every area you go to seems to have one or two segments where the developers just sort of threw all regard for the idea of thoughtful enemy placement right out the window. This problem usually arises from simply placing too many enemies in too small of an area for you to have enough space to fight them, with the player often being unfairly ganked by a group of enemies hiding underground or around a corner where you can't see them until it's too late, and in a manner straight out of the Scholar of the First Sin version of Dark Souls 2. You know, the version that completely ruined what is otherwise a fairly well-balanced game. #vanilla for life. And come to think of it, it almost feels as though the beginning of the game is balanced around Krill's full moveset rather than the sparse 2 attacks and a dodge that you start out with, almost as if the developers created the whole game right up until you reach the city of New Carcinia before deciding to add in the concept of skill trees and slowly unlocking abilities as you go. Though I do think this works thematically, and it does force you to focus on and really learn the ins and outs of the shell system during the early moments of the game, but I also can't deny that, with a few exceptions, the hardest part of the whole game is actually the first couple of hours. And of course, being a Souls-like, the game wouldn't be worth a damn without some excellent bosses to test your skills against, and this is unfortunately another aspect where the game is a bit hit or miss. Overall, the boss quality is all over the map, with some bosses like the Ceviche sisters being downright awful, as they're hardly any different from the regular pistol shrimp enemies that you fought in the area immediately preceding them, while others like the diseased lycanthrope and scuttling sludge steamroller are just okay. Bosses like Hykia, the intimidation crab, and Magista, the tyrant of Slacktide, are very good, while bosses like Grovekeeper Topoda and Roland the venture capitalist ending up as downright great, even rivaling some of my favorite bosses in the Soul series. Thankfully, when it comes to the bosses, I do think that the good greatly outweighs the bad, with only a handful feeling like a bit of a cop-out on the part of the developers. It's just a shame that one of these ends up being the final boss, which leads me into what I would consider to be the game's biggest flaw, and the one caveat to the game's heartful design that I've been teasing throughout the entire video. As Krill approaches the end of his journey, he comes into contact with a spectral being that is a representation of the very agony of the ocean itself, a being so full of pain and hatred brought on by the greed of the ocean's residents and the pollution of the humans above its waves that it simply wants it all to stop, and for all life within the ocean to come to an end. This being takes possession of Chitin and uses her to attack Krill, forcing him to fight one of the characters whom he's formed the strongest bond with throughout his journey. When you finally take the entity down, mortally wounding Chitin in the process, it lets out one final scream, releasing all the ocean's pain and suffering in a final death rattle that slowly burns itself out, choking on the very agony it sought to bring to an end. And it's sad, painful even to experience. This moment genuinely brought me to tears and gave me chills as I watched its health bar slowly drain without me having to do anything except dodge its feeble attacks, being given just enough time and space to reflect on my entire journey and the environmental tragedy that the game had so carefully presented. For a brief moment, I felt the very pain this entity represented, as in the back of my mind, I thought of the disgusting state the ocean is in thanks to humanity's wastefulness, hermit crabs making bottle caps and cans into shells and becoming a living reminder of how terrible our species is at taking care of this planet, sea turtles being maimed or suffocating from plastic that finds its way into the ocean, and a dreadful reminder that, in some small way, I'm just as much to blame for this as everyone else. That's the power of great art, and why I care so deeply about video games as a medium, and why I so heavily criticize developers when they don't answer the artistic call and don't follow their hearts when making games, and for only ever chasing the goal of making a piece of entertainment meant to distract people from their lives and the harsh realities of our world, rather than being brave enough to just let go and let their subconscious take the wheel and dictate where their art needs to go. I want games to be fun, but I also want them to move me, to change my perspective on life, to jolt me out of complacency and comfort, even if what they have to offer is painful or unsavory, frustrating or anger-inducing. And had Another Crab's Treasure ended right here, after this perfect representation of all the themes the game had worked so hard to craft, it not only would have dethroned Pepper Grinder as my favorite game of the year, but I might even have been willing to count it among my beloved Souls series as one of the finest games ever made. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Instead, it ends on a whimper with one of the worst endings I've ever seen. Seriously, it's really bad, and it unfortunately left quite the sour taste in my mouth after I finally put the game down, walking away from it not feeling devastated and humbled as I did after the boss that I just described, but cheated and angry at the developers for abandoning the path of heartful design in favor of delivering one of the most forced endings I've seen in a long time. After the death of the ocean's agony, as Krill tries desperately to save Chitin from both her wounds and the despair she feels after the tragedy that has just befallen them, Firth shows up out of nowhere and puts puts on the perfect whirl and suddenly decides that he's god of the entire ocean, transporting him and Krill to the surface on top of Trash Island that he's just now moved over the city of New Carcinia. He then makes a forced speech that sounds as though he's parodying every tech bro entrepreneur with grand designs of using their wealth and influence to make the world a better place, completely ignoring Krill's protest about the need to save Chitin, with the game not so subtly hinting that people like this only ever make it to the top through stealing from the little guy, as Krill is the one who put in all the hard work to obtain the perfect whirl, only for Firth to snatch it right out from under his nose. What follows is quite possibly the worst boss in the entire game, not only from a thematic standpoint, but a mechanical one as well, as Firth, even with his supposed godlike powers, is a pushover, despite all of his attacks being cheap shots that can easily catch you off guard. Maybe that's the point, to drive home the idea that people like him with grand designs of using our broken system to fix the broken system are all bark and no bite, but honestly, I don't even care, because this whole setup and final climax is so forced and pretentious that I have a hard time believing that it was thought up by the same developers who so expertly crafted the rest of the game. It almost feels as though the game was already completed, and then one of the developers got really angry at Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk and forced the rest of the team to quickly add in this final story arc in an attempt at placating their own resentment. Now, I want to make it clear that it's not the message I'm taking issue with here, but how it's presented, because for the most part, I actually agree with this sentiment that tech bros with delusions of saving the planet are actually doing more harm than good, but ultimately, I don't really care what the message of a piece of art is, so long as it's delivered with grace and nuance, and more importantly, comes about naturally through following the path of heart and trusting one's artistic muse, rather than allowing one's political beliefs and morals to dictate what needs to be included for the work to be considered a success. But grace and nuance and heartful design are the complete opposite of what this ending is. Instead, it stands in as a representation as everything antithetical to the very concept of authentic and impactful artistic expression. Not only because it sort of comes out of nowhere and doesn't feel like it draws naturally from the events leading up to it, but also because this is the moment when the game completely jumps the shark from delivering a subtle environmental message that, up until that point, was exceedingly well done, to grabbing the player by the scruff of the neck and screaming in their face that capitalism is ruining the ocean and that this whole game has been an allegory for how awful humanity and the economically minded are, and that you should be angry about it and fight like hell to make this world a better place, because if you don't, you're part of the problem and might as well just kill yourself and get the hell out of the way. Yeah, we got that. We're not stupid. It's pretty obvious that that was your message all along, and you did a fantastic job of conveying that up until this point, but you just couldn't help yourself and had to get preachy at the very end, didn't you? And ironically, by doing this, you ended up shooting your carefully constructed allegory in the face and letting it drop off of a cliff. And the really sad part about all this is that the game already had the perfect ending that reinforced this environmental theme and the need for people like Krill to use their powers to combat the evil of this world without ham-fistedly talking down to the audience and banging them over the head until the point is driven so far home that the very people who needed to hear your message in the first place are almost assuredly not going to listen to it out of sheer spite. Well shucking done. Ugh. Again, it's not the message I'm taking issue with here, it's how awfully it was handled. I actually do really like the idea of the final boss taking place on the island of trash as it hovers above New Carcinia, with the final battle causing it all to rain down and deliver this bittersweet ending where Krill accidentally makes things worse for everyone, yet they all sort of see him as a hero due to their misguided belief that the trash is something that makes their lives better. It's a very poignant gut punch ending that I feel was not only earned, but the proper way to end the game based on everything that led up to this moment. My question is, why not have this final fight be between Krill and the remainder of the ocean's agony that has possessed Chitin? I mean, you've sort of been teasing this potential fight between Chitin and Krill for the whole game anyway, and she already gets possessed. Why not just have her get possessed and take control of the perfect whirl after the final scream of the ocean's agony? That would have been impactful both thematically and allegorically, in addition to being a tragic character moment as Krill and Chitin are forced to fight one another. Except I know the reason why. It's because the developers really wanted the true evils of this game to be capitalism, the businessman, and humanity's reliance on fossil fuels. The problem is that that's not what the rest of your game is about. That's not what the muse of your otherwise heartful artistic pursuit was building towards, and the only moments when these true evils are touched upon come about from that same forceful need to express your political beliefs and worldview to the player. But the true message of the game, the one that came about from the artistic muse rather than from the developer's forced whims, the one that the the collective subconscious of the developers actually felt and wanted to express is one of tragedy and desperation, where there are no obvious villains and everyone's at fault in some way or another, and no one knows what to do about it, and there's nowhere to direct our anger and frustration, our shame and our guilt. It's a story of hopelessness and a feeble desire to do something, anything to make it better, but knowing deep down that there's very little that can be done. You might not think that logically, but subconsciously, that's what you feel. That's what your art has expressed. I know because it's right there in your work. It's plain as day, and I think the reason that one brief moment hit me so hard is because I feel it too. And that's the feeling you should have nurtured. You should have just let go and trust the artistic process, allowing it to dictate what your project was about, because moments where you did just that, you ended up creating one of the best games of the year, and certainly the best Souls-like around, and one that had a very poignant environmental message at its core and got the point across perfectly without being the least bit preachy, but everything that came about through your need to force other themes into the game has only undercut its high points and caused the ending of what is otherwise an exceptional game to not only fall flat, but taint the rest of the experience. This is why I advocate so strongly for the concept of heart and letting the work of art go where it wants to go, rather than forcing the project to fit a specific mold and shoehorning in specific themes and morals, because when you try to do that, it always comes at the cost of good art. If those themes and morals come about naturally through the act of creation, by all means follow them, see where they lead, but don't force them in because they fit with your worldview, or because you feel an obligation to try and benefit society with your art, because ironically, that's the quickest way to ensure that you end up failing to do just that. Ugh. Anyway, regardless of everything that I've just said, I still think Another Crab's Treasure is, overall, an incredible game, and despite me having spent the last third of this critique complaining about its terrible ending, I would still count it among my favorite games released so far this year. I honestly still think it's the best Souls-like we've yet gotten, which is saying something, as we've had over a decade of those now, and I'm blown away by the level of heart and quality that the vast majority of the game delivers. I love it dearly, which is why I'm so critical of how it ended, because while I do think that overall this game is amazing, it could have been even better had the developers not abandoned the path of true artistry and heart in the home stretch. And I still find myself genuinely excited to see where Aggro Crab goes from here and what their next project entails. It's clear to me that they're a talented bunch of people who absolutely have what it takes to shake the game industry to its very core and deliver impactful artistic experiences, and here's hoping that in the future they'll follow the muse just a little bit more and do exactly that. I'm Noa Lee, God of Game Criticism, and thus have I spoken.